Comrades! Today's topic of interest, Donkey Kong Country. While the Donkey Kong franchise has fallen into relative obscurity these days, back in the 1990s, it gave us two of the greatest games of the entire decade, those being Donkey Kong Country and Donkey Kong Country 2. These games were developed by Rare Studios, which became a major name in the 90s, off the buzz they attained from these games. As for why Nintendo, indisputably the biggest gaming company in the world at the time, after vanquishing Sega's competition, was interested in a small game studio that had not been unsuccessful, but did not exactly have an extensive history behind it, the answer lies, as it usually does in these cases, in the technology Rare had to offer. They were able to create 3D sprites using a CGI workstation. Nintendo was impressed and bought a large stake in the company, a move which paid enormous dividends when Donkey Kong Country was a major hit. In the gaming landscape of the 1990s, the DK Country games were revolutionary not only because they were tight platformers, but because of their visual stylings. It is not an exaggeration to say that these games paved the way for the lush, nuanced, vibrant worlds that would come to dominate 3D gaming at its best. But although technical power in gaming systems has increased drastically since the 90s, there are few games that can top the visual beauty of these games, and fewer still that can top their overall ambiance. As I've said before on this channel, the technical power of a system matters far less than how developers use that power. No, the game isn't nearly as high resolution as we expect these days, but modern developers can only dream of producing games as enthralling and immersive as DKC 1 and 2. That these games are beautiful is an easy point to make. DK1 features lush and verdant jungles, gorgeous yellow sunsets, cascading waterfalls, rippling waves, blankets of snow, and much, much more. Even the factory level is made suitably ominous and eerie. Donkey Kong 2 doubles down on the more rancid and revolting areas, but there is still breathtaking beauty in it. Turquoise waters crash against the hull of a pirate ship. Lava bursts and boils from a breathtaking volcano. Brambles coil and curve through a blue sky dotted with white clouds. Though themed worlds like the forest level and the snow level have been a key part of platformers since their inception, these worlds are usually thin and unimaginative. If it's a desert level, there are heaps of sand. If it's a jungle level, there are trees and poisonous creatures. This is not necessarily bad, but DK Country demonstrates that there is a more creative tack to take. Its worlds are immersive. Every detail is crafted with an eye toward transcending the vapid stereotypes surrounding themed worlds. These are not figments of a vague imagination, but genuinely thoughtful and complex locations that one can imagine traveling to. They have verisimilitude. It's a strategy more akin to that taken by great RPGs than that which is expected of platformers. This is a game where you find yourself putting down the controller when you arrive at a lull in the action and staring into the distance, at least for a few seconds, thinking about how gorgeous the world you're playing through truly is. But that's only part of the ambiance that has made the appeal of these games so long-lasting. Visuals are components to this equation. So are musical tracks, and the DKC series has the transcendent David Wise as its composer. He has composed some of the most iconic and immersive pieces of music in the history of gaming, such as Mining Melancholy and Sticker Brush Symphony. His pieces succeed not only because of their thunderous use of percussion or their sharp, easily identifiable melodies, but also because their low-key, floating feel adds to the lyrical rapture of the game rather than taking away from it. But ambiance is the equation as a whole. Ambiance is abstract. Ambiance cannot be pinned down to one source in particular, but rather it is attributed to the harmonious relationships between various components. Because of its vagueness, ambiance can be difficult to craft, but it is incredibly important. The ambiance is not going to be what the audience interacting with the work of art is going to be actively thinking about unless it overwhelms them so profoundly that they have no choice but to think of it. However, it is what the audience is going to be immersed in. This is especially true in video games. In other forms of art, ambiance is merely what surrounds characters and the narrative, involving these characters. Descriptions, whether literary or visual, are interesting only as they relate to the characters. A spectacular fireworks display should only be included if it has relevance for the characters watching it. The nature of that relevance is determined by the artist. The display could reflect a character's satisfaction or their hopes for the future, or, on the other hand, it could be juxtaposed to the emotional state of a character who has suffered a profound disappointment. But it must be relevant. In games, however, character and narrative have traditionally been viewed as less important. That has been changing over the last 15 to 20 years, but a video game without a substantial narrative can succeed more straightforwardly than a film or book without a substantial narrative. More focus is thus placed on the ambiance. The gameplay might be what is directly involving the gamer, but the ambiance is what soaks into the player as they progress through the levels. Crafting environments that deserve to be remembered is of high importance. A few minor details or an unexpected musical track can be the difference between a boring, barren wasteland and a fascinating, eye-opening area. This is vital for developers to remember as they progress into a gaming landscape that has finally realized that the best way for it to succeed is not to copy blockbuster films or offer the largest open worlds possible, but rather to use the distinctive interactivity of gaming to immerse players deeper in the worlds the games take place in. Gaming is the one medium where the audience can spend however much time they like in a given location, and a great developer takes this opportunity to ensure that its locations deserve large chunks of the audience's time. This was known in the 1990s when Donkey Kong Country was released, but it was partially forgotten when the 3D boom struck, and developers raced to make games look as realistic as possible without even considering if there was genuine purpose behind this thrust toward realism. Thankfully, the importance of ambiance seems to have been remembered again. 2017 was one of the greatest years in the history of the video gaming industry, and while 2018 has not been nearly as promising, the influence of games such as Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey is still tangible. The ambiance is what is remembered in games where the plot is not the focus. The glut of middling to downright terrible open-world games that were released in Skyrim's shadow are not thought of, when they're thought of at all, for the size of their worlds, but rather for their unpleasant, uninteresting, and utterly tedious atmospheres. Likewise, the first two Donkey Kong Country games are rightly considered some of the best games of the 90s, not because the excuse plots they featured warranted dozens of articles discussing their nuances, nor because Donkey and Diddy were these complex characters unable to achieve the lives they envisioned for themselves because of personal flaws that they're unable to navigate because they purposefully deny their existences, because to accept these flaws would be to necessitate the formation of an entirely new self-perception. No. They're considered some of the best games of the 1990s because of a combination of taut, creatively designed platforming and, even more importantly, incredibly immersive ambiance. An atmosphere that is equal parts soothing and evocative, equal parts natural and otherworldly. It's hard to believe that the DK franchise was one of the most promising in the entire industry back in the 90s, considering that it's at best a second-tier, unfairly forgotten franchise these days. There are two lessons that can be rightly derived from this. The first is that a franchise staying at the top of the gaming landscape is more difficult than could be expected by examining the continued successes of Mario and Zelda. For every Pokémon, there's a Banjo-Kazooie or Spyro. The second lesson is more encouraging. It is that old ideas and approaches that have been discarded can emerge again. The Donkey Kong Country games are more respected and influential than they were 10 years ago, when their atmosphere-heavy, story-light approach was written off as the relic of a bygone era. The commonplace thinking from the middle and late 2000s that there is little that could be taken from games released before the 3D revolution and applied to contemporary games has been thoroughly debunked. So if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more ambient content. Also, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that sweeping, immersive stuff. Adios, comrades!